we got the services data for the Caixin sort of rolling over. That's supposed to be what's going to lead China out of this economic malaise.
True enough. And it clearly is a disappointment. We saw the NBS, the National Bureau of Statistics official PMI for services earlier in the week, and now the Caixin, and whether you're looking at manufacturing or non-manufacturing, Caixin tends to give you a broader diffusion of smaller companies as opposed to the big companies that are concentrated in the official statistic. Either way you look at it, the services number is headed down, and
right.
to the degree that we're dipping either below 50 or close to 50, it's not good.
So what does this tell us about China's attempt to transition its economy to one that's a services-driven rather than one that's export-driven?
Right.
I mean, some people argue that it hasn't even begun yet, that effort.
Right. Well, so we would take the other side of that argument. While the trend clearly has been for slowing, if you look at the statistics in terms of service versus manufacturing as a component of the economy, there's clearly already ground that's being made from the standpoint of services becoming more and more of a piece. The rebalancing as we see it is going from export-oriented manufacturing to domestic-oriented service and consumption. And if you look at consumption versus investment, we're seeing the same sort of thing that you see in that chart, where you've got the shift toward consumption away from investment, you've got the shift towards services away from manufacturing. It's a question of pace now.
And also the reforms. That is really quite key for China. And part of that is getting rid of the excess capacity that China winds up having. And one particular chart really sums it up. If you look at the ferrous versus non-ferrous metals and the fixed asset investment that came into China over the last few years, you can see an enormous increase into things like carbon steel, stainless steel, iron. That's the ferrous metals. That needs to stop and go away before China can truly rebalance.
And, one of the things that we should hear about from the NPC, it's a question of how much, is the specifics of where do we go for the next 5 years. This is the NPC that gives us the next 5-year plan. We got a preliminary view of it back in November. We get the final version of it actually on Saturday, and it'll be widely discussed. They need to point out how they go from overinvestment and excess capacity, how do they consolidate those industries, how do they push those companies to look, the big ones most notably, to be looking abroad and gearing from investment in things like non-ferrous metals towards things like technology, healthcare, education, etc.
And travel as well, because the number of people moving around the country spending money on services. Does China have the capacity to manage all of that?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing, because if you look at what's going on with travel, as you can see, in this chart, this is showing both domestic as well as international air travel. It's been, soaring, to use the pun, and it's not stopping. And there's 2 points to make there. One is, the activity is still happening. The growth in consumption is still happening. The mass market is still growing. But there is good infrastructure that needs to be put in place, for example, with rails, with airports, that will continue to feed that story. And, it's the opposite of where they were.